Most people saw gas prices climbing and probably thought, this is going to sting for a bit, but it'll settle down. But what if this isn't one of those normal price spikes? What if we're actually looking at a permanent structural fracture in how energy moves around the globe? And what if the real story behind your shrinking bank account started in a tiny stretch of water that most people have literally never even heard of?
It all comes down to a tiny root's massive power. To really get a grip on this, we have to look at the Middle East, specifically the Strait of Hormuz. It's this incredibly narrow choke point where roughly 25% of all global seaborne oil normally moves every single day. But major conflict in the region created extreme tension around that exact spot. As shipping got complicated and security risks shot up, energy markets basically panicked. And drivers? We felt it almost instantly, watching the national average surge to $4.52 by mid-May. Look at how aggressively this timeline escalated. On February 28th, Operation Epic Fury triggers a blockade response. By April 13th, the U.S. Navy enforces its own formal port blockade. And just weeks after that, on May 4th, Operation Project Freedom starts trying to escort commercial ships. So in just over 2 months, a vital global artery was completely choked off by a rigid dual blockade. But here is where things take a serious turn, because physical supply wasn't actually the only problem. When fear outpaces supply, markets don't wait for reality. They react to the panic first. Suddenly, commercial operators had to ask themselves if moving ships through this area was even worth the risk anymore. The U.S. government actually stepped in, setting up a massive $40 billion maritime reinsurance facility to backstop them. But here's the crazy part. Industry reports indicate that facility hasn't provided a single dollar of coverage, literally $0 in business. Why? Because without permanent naval escorts, ship owners flat out refuse to risk their crews. As a result, commercial war risk insurance premiums absolutely skyrocketed to between 3 and 8% of a ship's total value. When you do the math on that, it effectively halted normal commercial traffic entirely. Fear itself became this massive, insurmountable tax. So naturally, the pump shock deepens. Suddenly, this wasn't just some abstract geopolitical story playing out overseas. It became intensely personal at gas stations right down the street. And the pain wasn't distributed equally at all. Look at this massive coastal divide. While the national average had been sitting below $3, it shot up everywhere. But in states like Georgia, it hit $4 a gallon, whereas California surged way past $6.15. These insane regional spikes were driven by severe logistical bottlenecks and certain states just having a much heavier reliance on costlier foreign maritime imports. For the average household, this became a brutal mathematical reality. Families sitting at the kitchen table doing the mental math realized that filling up a standard pickup truck jumped by over $55 for a single tank. That extra burden translates directly into an immediate reduction in non-essential household spending. You still have to drive to work, right? Which means something else in the budget has to get cut. But while everyone is staring at gas prices, there's diesel, the hidden cost. Gasoline prices are highly visible. They're on giant lit-up signs on every single corner. But the story causing the most quiet economic devastation is actually diesel. It quietly powers the entire background system of everyday life. We're talking freight trucks, agriculture, heavy supply chains. You probably don't look at diesel prices until it starts squeezing literally everything else you buy. We saw a violent 45 to 50% surge in the cost of commercial diesel. And when the fuel that powers freight jumps that high, the cost of your groceries, basic goods, and home deliveries all react instantly. Retail distributors are forced to raise prices, severely disrupting domestic supply chains and heavily compounding this broader cost of living crisis we're all feeling. Now you might be wondering, will government action work? Officials aren't just sitting around watching this happen. The administration actually deployed some seriously aggressive emergency steps. They staggered the release of 172 million barrels from our strategic oil reserves. They issued Jones Act waivers, which basically allows foreign flag ships to move domestic energy. They pushed emergency high ethanol fuel waivers. And they even invoked wartime powers under the Defense Production Act to force more domestic oil extraction. But here is the really frustrating reality of how energy systems work. Energy analyst Skip York hit the nail on the head when he said, "Prices rise like a rocket, but they fall like a feather." Even with all this massive government intervention starting today, structural retail price declines take a very long time to actually materialize. meaning you, as a driver, won't necessarily see immediate relief at the pump tomorrow just because a policy was signed today. Furthermore, the government's ability to provide you with actual domestic economic relief is severely tied up in a massive fiscal feedback loop. Think about this. Military operations in the region have already cost $29 billion, mostly to replace destroyed high-value assets. To sustain this posture, we're looking at a staggering proposed defense budget of $1.5 trillion for fiscal year 2027. A financial commitment that huge drastically limits any federal capacity for non-defense economic relief. Which leaves a much bigger, much heavier question hanging over all of this. How long can this last? Markets can usually absorb a short, sharp shock, but these revised U.S. Energy Information Administration projections are pretty sobering. Even if diplomatic negotiations succeed tomorrow, average retail gas is projected to sit at $3.88 through 2026, and still at $3.62 going into 2027. It could literally take years for production and trade patterns to fully resume normal operations. The longer uncertainty sticks around, the more global businesses and entire supply chains adapt and permanently reroute. And those systems rarely just snap right back to how they were. Which leads us to a pretty chilling thought. What if the sudden climb up in prices was actually the easy part of this crisis?
An investment in knowledge pays the best interest, so why not invest in this channel? Click like and subscribe for more.